What if the most dangerous person you ever let into your life did not arrive looking dangerous at all? What if they did not come in with cruelty on their face, poison in their voice, or chaos in their hands? What if they came in smiling? What if they came in sounding safe? What if the very thing that destroyed your peace was the same thing that first felt like rescue? That is the part no one tells you soon enough. The manipulation never starts ugly. It starts beautiful. It starts soft. It starts with timing so perfect it feels almost supernatural. It starts with a person who seems to appear exactly when your heart is tired, when your guard is low, when your life has left one quiet empty room inside you that nobody else seemed able to reach. And that is why it works. Because if manipulation looked monstrous at the beginning, almost no one would stay. If control sounded like control on day one, if deception introduced itself honestly, if emotional exploitation knocked on your door and announced itself like a storm, you would close the door. You would step back. You would protect yourself. But that is not how these stories begin. They begin with warmth that feels strangely personal. Attention that feels almost healing. A look that lingers 1 second longer than expected. Questions that seem deeper than normal. Words that land exactly where your loneliness lives. You do not feel hunted. You feel found. And that is what makes it so chilling. Because later, when the confusion begins, when the disrespect starts slipping through the cracks, when something in your body tightens but you cannot yet explain why, you do not think, this person is manipulating me. You think, maybe I misunderstood. Then later, maybe they're stressed. Then later, maybe I'm too sensitive. Then later, maybe this is my fault. And by the time you finally start asking the right question, you are no longer asking, why are they doing this to me? You are asking something far more tragic. How did I stop trusting myself? That is the real beginning of the nightmare. Not the first insult. Not the first lie. Not even the first cold withdrawal. The real beginning is the moment your own mind starts turning against you. The moment you begin defending the very person who is quietly unraveling your reality. The moment you start explaining away what you felt because the version of them you met at the beginning was just so convincing, so magnetic, so emotionally precise, that you cannot bear to believe it may have been part of the setup. And yes, that word matters. Setup. Because many people spend years feeling ashamed of how they got trapped, when the truth is much more sobering than that, they were not foolish. They were conditioned. They were not blind. They were slowly trained to doubt what they saw. They were not weak. They were simply human in the presence of someone who knew how to weaponize human hope. Imagine walking into a beautiful house at twilight. The lights are warm. The music is low. The room smells like safety. Everything inside tells your nervous system to relax. So you do. You sit down. You breathe. You let your shoulders soften. You think, maybe this is what peace feels like. Only later do you realize the locks clicked behind you the moment you stepped inside. That is how narcissistic manipulation often works. It does not drag you in by force. It invites you in through longing. Through chemistry. Through emotional recognition. Through the exquisite relief of feeling chosen. Maybe you met them in a season when you were grieving. Maybe after heartbreak. Maybe after years of being overlooked. Maybe when life had worn you down enough that kindness felt almost holy. Maybe when you were trying to rebuild something in yourself and they appeared like the answer to a question you had not yet spoken out loud. They noticed you. They listened. They made you feel vivid again. And for a little while, it may have felt like life had finally given you something good. That is why this topic is so important. Because people on the outside often judge the middle of the story without understanding the beginning. They look at the person who stayed too long, explained too much, forgave too often, shrank themselves, second-guessed themselves, and they ask, "Why didn't you leave sooner?" But that question misses the real story. The real story is that nothing this destructive would ever succeed if it introduced itself honestly. It had to feel special first. It had to feel intimate first. It had to feel like home before it became a prison. That is the pattern. The beginning feels magical. The middle feels confusing. The ending feels like erosion. And somewhere inside that erosion, people lose more than time. They lose their center. Their clarity. Their words. Their appetite. Their confidence. Their laughter. Their ability to tell the difference between discomfort and disloyalty. They start censoring themselves in conversations that once felt easy. They start watching tone, timing, mood shifts, silences. They stop asking, "What do I feel?" and start asking, "What will keep the peace?" That is not love. That is survival inside distortion. And one of the hardest truths to face is this: the person who damaged you most may have first felt like the person who understood you best. Let that sink in. The very reason you stayed may be the very reason you now feel so betrayed. Because it is one thing to be hurt by someone who was openly cruel from the start. It is another thing entirely to be unraveled by someone who first felt like sunlight after a long winter. That kind of pain reaches deeper. It does not just break your heart. It makes you suspicious of your own instincts. It makes you question your judgment. It tempts you to rewrite the entire story as a personal failure. But it was not a personal failure. It was a psychological trap disguised as connection. And if that truth lands hard, it is because deep down, part of you already knew something was wrong long before you had words for it. Your body knew. Your exhaustion knew. Your confusion knew. The heaviness you felt after certain conversations knew. The version of you that kept getting smaller knew. This video is for that version of you. For the person who keeps replaying conversations trying to understand how they ended up apologizing again. For the person who misses who they used to be. For the person who still wonders whether they were too emotional, too demanding, too difficult, when in reality they may have simply been responding to a person who needed them uncertain in order to stay powerful. Because that is the dark secret underneath so much narcissistic manipulation: their power does not come from strength. It comes from your confusion. Their influence grows every time you doubt your own perception. Every time you silence your own discomfort. Every time you trade what you know for what they insist is true. And once you understand that, something begins to change. Because awareness is not bitterness. Awareness is the first breath of freedom. So if this kind of content speaks to something you have lived, questioned, or quietly carried for too long, subscribe to the channel and support the work here. It helps this channel keep creating honest, powerful videos that do more than just describe the pain. We want to help people understand it, name it, and come back to themselves with more clarity, dignity, and strength. Now let me ask you something, and I want you to be honest with yourself before you answer. When a relationship starts feeling intense very quickly, what do you instinctively assume? A. It means the connection is rare and deeply real. B. It might feel exciting, but real safety still takes time. Comment A or B below. Your answer may reveal more about your relationship patterns than you think. Love bombing, when intensity pretends to be intimacy. Claire did not fall because she was desperate. That is the lie people tell themselves when they want a simple explanation for a complicated wound. She fell because what happened to her did not feel reckless at the time. It felt rare. It felt almost divinely timed. It felt like one of those impossible moments life only gives a person once or twice, when someone steps into your world and seems to understand your heart before you have fully explained it yourself. That is the danger of love bombing. It does not feel like deception while you are inside it. It feels like recognition. It feels like relief. It feels like finally meeting someone who is not afraid of depth, not afraid of affection, not afraid to be clear. In a culture where so many people hide behind mixed signals, emotional ambiguity, and half-hearted attention, overwhelming intensity can look like emotional courage. It can feel like a blessing. That is exactly why it works so well. By the time Claire met Ethan, she had already learned how to live with disappointment without making a scene about it. She had become the kind of woman who knew how to carry herself through Manhattan with grace even when she was tired, even when she was lonely, even when life had quietly narrowed into work, obligations, polite dinners, and the dim ache of wanting something real. She was not naive. She was not impulsive. She was not the kind of woman who confused flattery for substance. And still, Ethan got in. Not because he forced his way in. Because he arrived in a form her nervous system wanted to trust. He noticed everything. Not in the performative way some men do, where attention feels rehearsed and compliments feel generic. Ethan's attention seemed unusually precise. He remembered the smallest details Claire mentioned in passing, the kind of details most people let evaporate the moment the conversation moves on. He remembered the author she said she had loved at 21. He remembered that she hated cold coffee but always forgot to drink it while it was hot. He remembered the sentence she used when she described her mother, she loved quietly. The next week, he brought it up again with such tenderness that Claire felt something inside her soften without permission. This is what love bombing often does. It does not merely flatter the ego. It studies the emotional architecture of the other person and then speaks directly into it. It creates the feeling that someone is not just interested in you, but deeply attuned to you. The attention feels personal, tailored, intimate. You do not feel pursued in a shallow way. You feel chosen in a sacred one. That distinction matters because most people are not actually looking for excess. They are looking for sincerity. They want to believe that intensity means truth. They want to believe that quick emotional movement means strong emotional substance. So when a narcissistic person shows up with enormous warmth, certainty, admiration, and apparent vulnerability, it does not set off alarm bells at first. It feels like the thing everyone says is so hard to find. Ethan texted Claire in the mornings before she woke up and at night before she fell asleep. Not in a clingy way. In a way that made her feel gently held in someone's mind. He sent photos from his day with little observations that made her laugh. He found reasons to weave her into his language, as if she were already part of the internal landscape of his life. When they were together, he made the world narrow beautifully. He looked at her the way people in films look at each other just before the music rises. He spoke with astonishing certainty about how unusual their connection was. Not maybe. Not possibly. Not let's see. He spoke as though he had already recognized something undeniable and was brave enough to name it. For a while, Claire did not see danger in that certainty. She saw maturity. She saw emotional availability. She saw a man who did not need to play games because he knew what he felt. And this is where love bombing becomes especially cruel. It borrows the emotional language of secure attachment while quietly laying the groundwork for control. It makes speed look like depth. It makes emotional flooding look like intimacy. It makes the target feel almost guilty for wanting time, caution, or space because everything is wrapped in apparent sincerity. If someone seems this open, this excited, this invested, what kind of guarded person would hold back? So Claire did what many thoughtful, self-aware people do when they encounter someone who appears emotionally genuine. She relaxed just a little faster than she normally would have. She offered more of her interior life. She let Ethan occupy more emotional space than time alone would have earned. Not because she was careless, but because intensity creates an illusion of proven closeness. The heart begins responding to a future that has not yet been built. That is one of the least understood aspects of love bombing. It is not simply too much attention. It is accelerated attachment. It creates emotional momentum before reality has had the chance to test anything. Before disagreement. Before disappointment. Before inconvenience. Before limits. Before you have seen who this person becomes when they are not actively trying to win your trust. The beginning is often dazzling because it is designed to be. The narcissistic person does not always think in those exact words, but the instinct is the same, creates so much emotional intensity that the other person starts bonding before discernment has fully formed. Once that happens, the standard for what counts as a red flag changes. The target does not evaluate new behavior on its own terms. They evaluate it against the emotional height of the beginning. That is the trap. Because the more intoxicating the beginning, the more disorienting the shift that comes later. Claire would eventually realize that one of the reasons Ethan's early devotion felt so unforgettable was because it carried no ordinary hesitation. He did not seem to wonder if they were compatible. He behaved as though compatibility had already been proven. He did not gradually get to know her. He moved with the confidence of someone who had already decided she was extraordinary, already decided they were different from other people, already decided this was meaningful enough to fast-track. To a lonely or wounded heart, that can feel miraculous. To a manipulative person, it is efficient. What made the experience even harder to interpret was that Ethan's intensity did not feel shallow. It was emotionally textured. He did not just compliment Claire's appearance. He admired her restraint, her intelligence, the sadness behind her composure, the tenderness she rarely showed publicly. He made her feel understood in a way that cut deeper than ordinary attraction. It was not lust dressed up as romance. It felt more refined than that. More intelligent. More intimate. But that is exactly why love bombing can be so destabilizing in hindsight. The victim does not only miss the attention. They miss the version of themselves that existed inside that attention. Claire did not just miss Ethan. She missed the woman she briefly got to be when someone seemed to cherish her so completely. The woman who felt radiant, interesting, emotionally safe, deeply wanted. When the relationship later turned colder, harsher, more slippery, she did not merely grieve the man. She grieved the emotional reality he had manufactured around her. That grief can keep people stuck for a long time. Because they are not only asking, was he lying? They are asking, was any of what I felt real? The answer is painful and important. Yes, what Claire felt was real. The hope was real. The relief was real. The tenderness that opened in her was real. The emotional expansion was real. What was false was not her response. What was false was the stability of the structure inviting that response. Love bombing is so destructive because it makes a person emotionally commit to a story before the facts are in. The body is already attached. The imagination is already involved. The nervous system has already started building an association between this person and safety, excitement, meaning, future. So when inconsistencies begin to surface, the mind does not want to interpret them accurately. It wants to protect the bond. It wants to preserve the magic. It wants to believe the early intensity was the truth and the current discomfort is the exception. And that desire to preserve the beginning is exactly what narcissistic manipulation feeds on. The target becomes an archivist of beautiful moments. They collect texts, glances, nights, promises, tenderness, future plans, little acts of devotion, and keep laying them over the current pain as proof that the connection must still be real underneath whatever has gone wrong. The beginning becomes an emotional weapon. Not because the target is irrational, but because the contrast is so powerful. Healthy intimacy builds trust through consistency. Love bombing builds dependency through emotional velocity. That difference may sound subtle, but it changes everything. A healthy person may be excited about you, deeply drawn to you, expressive and affectionate. But healthy affection leaves room for reality. It does not need to rush past mystery. It does not need to claim forever before it has lived through ordinary days. It does not try to create closeness so fast that your skepticism feels almost ungrateful. Real intimacy can survive pacing. That is the line Claire did not yet understand. Anything that cannot survive pacing is not asking for love. It is asking for surrender. Looking back, she would remember how often Ethan made slowness feel unnecessary, almost inferior. Why hold back when something feels this clear? Why analyze what your heart already knows? Why be cautious when caution is exactly what keeps people from real connection? His language was never openly pressuring. That would have been easier to resist. Instead, it wrapped urgency in romance. It made restraint feel like fear and speed feel like courage. That is one of the ugliest tricks of all. Because love bombing does not only flood you with attention. It quietly reframes your instincts. It makes caution feel cold. It makes boundaries feel tragic. It makes discernment feel like self-sabotage. And if you have spent years longing for a great love that feels undeniable, that reframing can pierce straight through your better judgment. Claire did not need more intelligence. She needed more time. More observation. More room to see whether Ethan's intensity could survive real life without turning into entitlement, withdrawal, or control. That is the lesson hidden under all the heartbreak. Not that strong feelings are bad. Not that excitement is dangerous. Not that affection should be mistrusted. But that intensity and intimacy are not the same thing. One can arrive in a week. The other reveals itself over time. And sometimes the people who make you feel the most wanted, the fastest, are not drawing you into love. They are drawing you past your own gate before you realize how much of yourself you have already let in. Mirroring, the trick that makes you feel finally understood. There is a kind of loneliness so sharp, so old, and so private that when someone seems to touch it without being told where it lives, it can feel like fate. That is what mirroring does. It does not simply make you feel liked. It makes you feel recognized. Not in the surface level way people often talk about attraction, where someone notices your smile, your style, your intelligence, your sense of humor. Mirroring goes deeper than that. It creates the intoxicating sensation that another person has somehow found a hidden map of you. The private places. The old wounds. The quiet ambitions. The language you use when you are trying to explain things you do not usually trust people to understand. And when that happens, it can feel almost sacred. By the time Claire was fully inside Ethan's orbit, there was already a dangerous belief growing in her, though she could not yet see it clearly. She believed he understood her in a way that was unusually rare. Not just more than other men. More than most people. More than friends who had known her for years. More than colleagues who admired her. More than anyone who had only known her for a short time reasonably should have. That belief did not arrive by accident. It was built carefully, moment by moment, through a kind of emotional precision that made her feel both relieved and exposed. Ethan had a way of reflecting Claire back to herself that felt deeply personal. If she spoke about growing up in a house where love was present but never fully spoken, he would not just nod and say he understood. He would answer with his own story in a way that seemed to echo the exact emotional temperature of hers. If she spoke about how exhausting it felt to be perceived as strong all the time, he would respond not with generic admiration but with language that suggested he had seen the fatigue beneath her elegance before anyone else. If she mentioned a book that had once made her feel less alone in her 20s, he had either read it too or seemed to grasp immediately why that book, of all books, mattered. He did not simply agree with her. He resonated. That distinction is what makes mirroring so difficult to detect at first. Agreement can feel flattering, but resonance feels intimate. Agreement says, I like what you like. Resonance says, I know what it means to be you. And that is the trick. Because when someone creates that feeling quickly enough, the nervous system starts relaxing around them before character has been proven. The heart begins making room for a person based not on what they have consistently shown, but on how powerfully they seem to reflect your inner world. Claire did not think of herself as someone easy to impress. Manhattan had long since trained her out of that. She had met polished people, brilliant people, charismatic people, emotionally articulate people. She had seen what performance looked like. She knew that charm could be strategic. She knew that language could be polished enough to imitate sincerity. But Ethan did not feel polished in a shallow way. He felt uncannily aligned. That was different. He knew how to step into a conversation and make it feel as though he was not merely learning facts about her, but recognizing something he had always known. The music she loved. The way she needed silence after emotionally demanding days. Her distaste for loud self-promotion. The tenderness she felt around old black and white films. The strange mix of ambition and retreat that defined her. The fact that she was not drawn to people who dazzled publicly, but to those who seemed to carry some private sadness with dignity. It was all there. And for a woman who had spent much of her adult life being admired in ways that often felt incomplete, Ethan's apparent understanding was intoxicating. Claire had been desired before. She had been complimented, pursued, respected, even envied. But being mirrored this way was different. It did not feel like being watched. It felt like being discovered. That is why mirroring is such a powerful manipulative tactic. It bypasses ordinary skepticism by offering something more psychologically seductive than praise. It offers relief. Relief from the exhausting task of having to explain yourself. Relief from the fear of being misunderstood. Relief from the quiet alienation so many people carry into adulthood after years of being seen only in fragments. When someone seems to say, without saying it directly, I know your language too, defenses begin to fall in ways that feel completely natural. The problem is that being reflected is not the same as being held. A narcissistic person can mirror your values without sharing your integrity. They can mirror your pain without respecting its vulnerability. They can mirror your depth without having any real capacity for mutuality. What they are often doing is studying the architecture of your selfhood and then stepping into it convincingly enough that you begin mistaking imitation for intimacy. That is the cruelty of it. It is not always a lie in the obvious sense. Sometimes the manipulator really is responding to things they observe accurately. Sometimes they are emotionally intelligent enough to sense what makes a person feel seen. But the purpose is different. The reflection is not offered as a gift of true recognition. It is offered as a shortcut to trust. And trust gained too quickly is often trust gained without sufficient truth. Claire began revealing more of herself to Ethan not because he demanded it, but because he made disclosure feel safe. That is how this works. The target does not usually feel pressured. They feel invited. There is warmth, rhythm, and emotional reciprocity. You share something vulnerable, and the other person seems to meet it with something equally personal. You speak about your fears, and they seem to name their own. You reveal your values, and they seem to share them. You describe what matters most to you, and suddenly they appear to be made of the same material. What could possibly feel more intimate than that? And yet real intimacy is not made of resemblance alone. That is the part people often learn too late. Real intimacy is tested by friction, by disappointment, by ordinary life, by limits, by unmet expectations, by complexity. Real intimacy deepens when reality enters the room and both people remain emotionally responsible. Mirroring, by contrast, often shines brightest before reality has had a chance to complicate the projection. It creates emotional altitude before the structure underneath has been truly examined. That is why so many relationships built on mirroring feel breathtaking at the beginning and destabilizing later. The early sense of sameness is so intense that when contradictions appear, the target resists them. They think, this cannot be who they really are. They understand me too deeply. They know me too well. They must still be the person I felt so close to. But sometimes what you felt so close to was not their actual self. It was their reflection of yours. That can be one of the hardest truths to survive. Because when the illusion starts cracking, the loss is not simple. Claire was not just grieving Ethan. She was grieving the emotional world she believed existed between them. She was grieving the idea that she had finally found someone who met her in the places where she usually stood alone. She was grieving the intoxicating comfort of not having to translate her own interior life for once. And grief like that cuts very deep because it makes a person question not just the relationship, but their own perception. Was it all fake? Did I imagine the connection? Was I seeing what I wanted to see? Did I create meaning where there was only performance? Those are painful questions, but they can also be misleading. What Claire felt was real. The comfort was real. The hope was real. The softening in her was real. The fact that Ethan's reflection was manipulative does not make her response foolish or false. It means her humanity was met by someone who knew how to weaponize emotional familiarity. There is another reason mirroring can be so confusing. It often does not look like obvious copying. A skilled narcissistic person does not merely repeat your preferences back to you in a clumsy way. They absorb your emotional style. They learn what kind of person you believe yourself to be and begin inhabiting a version of that world. If you value depth, they become deep. If you admire restraint, they become restrained. If you love honesty, they speak the language of truth. If you care about healing, they become fluent in the vocabulary of growth, trauma, boundaries, and self-awareness. They do not just mirror what you like. They mirror what you trust. That is why discernment matters so much here. Not cynicism. Not fear. Not the hardening that says no one can ever understand you. Discernment is gentler than that and stronger. It means allowing recognition to breathe long enough for reality to reveal itself. It means understanding that similarity, no matter how emotionally stirring, is not a substitute for consistency. It means noticing whether the person who seems to understand your pain also knows how to protect it. Whether the person who speaks your language also knows how to honor your limits. Whether the person who appears deeply aligned with your values can still act with integrity when things become inconvenient. Because that is where the truth lives. Not in how accurately someone reflects your inner world during candlelit conversations or late-night confessions, but in how they handle your humanity when it stops being poetic and starts becoming real. Claire would eventually understand that Ethan had not simply made her feel seen. He had made her feel legible to herself through him. That is a dangerous thing. The moment another person starts feeling like the clearest mirror of who you are, you become vulnerable to losing yourself in their version of you. And that is why mirroring feels so magical at first and so shattering later. It does not merely create closeness. It creates dependency on recognition. You stop feeling like someone who is known in your own right and start feeling most real when reflected back by them. But no healthy love requires you to borrow your identity from another person's gaze. Real love may understand you, yes. It may even surprise you with how deeply it sees. But it does not make you disappear into the reflection. It does not rush you into trust through sameness alone. It does not ask you to mistake emotional symmetry for truth. Sometimes the people who seem to understand you instantly are not meeting your soul. They are reading your blueprint. And there is a world of difference between being known and being expertly observed. Gaslighting, the tactic that turns your mind against you. There is a particular kind of violence that leaves no bruise, no broken object on the floor, no witness who can point to the exact second everything changed. It happens in conversation. In tone. In pauses. In the tiny, almost invisible edits one person makes to another person's reality until the second person no longer knows whether what they felt was real, whether what they heard was accurate, whether their own mind is still a safe place to live. That is gaslighting. And what makes it so devastating is not only that it hurts. It is that it recruits your own intelligence into the destruction. It turns your memory into a courtroom, your emotions into unreliable witnesses, and your instincts into something you begin to cross-examine instead of trust. By the time Claire began to understand what Ethan was doing, she was no longer fighting with him about facts. She was fighting with herself about whether she had the right to feel hurt at all. That is how this tactic works. It does not simply deny reality. It makes you feel guilty for having won. At first, the shifts were small enough to explain away. A comment Ethan made at dinner in front of friends that landed a little too sharply. A joke with a hidden edge. A private detail Claire had trusted him with, repeated lightly in public and then covered with a smile. She would bring it up later, not dramatically, not accusingly, just honestly. She would say that something felt off. That something hurt. That she did not think he meant to humiliate her, but that it had felt humiliating anyway. A healthy person, even a defensive one, might have struggled with the feedback but still stayed in contact with the truth of her experience. Ethan did something far more disorienting. He did not meet her in what she felt. He shifted the ground underneath it. That's not what happened. You're making it sound worse than it was. You always hear things through the darkest filter. It was obviously a joke. You were laughing too. I think you were already in a mood before dinner. You do this thing where you decide what I meant instead of listening to what I actually said. Notice how subtle that is. He did not always sound cruel. Sometimes he sounded calm. Sometimes rational. Sometimes almost patient. That calmness was part of the trap. Claire would come into the conversation carrying discomfort, confusion, and a genuine desire to understand. Ethan would respond as though he were the stable one trying to guide an emotionally distorted person back toward reason. And suddenly the original issue disappeared. The issue was no longer what he said. The issue was Claire's interpretation. Then Claire's sensitivity. Then Claire's emotional patterns. Then Claire's memory. Then Claire's stability. That is the real machinery of gaslighting. It does not merely reject your version of events. It redirects the spotlight from the wound to your perception of the wound. The pain you came in trying to discuss gets replaced by a new and much more destabilizing question: can you trust yourself at all? Most people do not realize how deeply damaging that question becomes when it is repeated over time. Because in the beginning, Claire still had strong access to her own inner signals. She knew when she felt belittled. She knew when a conversation left her drained. She knew when Ethan's warmth shifted into coldness so suddenly that her body tightened before her mind had words. But every time she tried to speak from that knowing, he met her with some version of reinterpretation. Not always loudly. Not always with obvious malice. Sometimes with a sigh. Sometimes with concern. Sometimes with the weary energy of a man burdened by a woman who was forever misunderstanding him. And that made the whole thing more lethal. If someone screams at you, your body knows you are in danger. If someone lies brazenly, you can eventually point to the lie. But gaslighting often comes wrapped in just enough plausibility to keep your mind working against your own body. The discomfort is real, but the explanation is always being rewritten. So you stay inside the puzzle. You replay. You reconsider. You question your tone, your timing, your phrasing, your face, your memory, your motives. You stop saying, "That hurt." You start saying, "Maybe I didn't explain it well." That shift is expensive. Over time, Claire became less spontaneous in conflict. Then less spontaneous in conversation. Then less spontaneous, period. She started mentally editing her reactions before they even left her mouth. She would feel a flash of pain, but instead of trusting it, she would pause and begin negotiating with herself. Am I overreacting? Did he really mean it that way? Am I being unfair? Was I too tired? Did I set the wrong tone first? Maybe I am more fragile lately. Maybe I'm making problems where there are none. That internal negotiation was not wisdom. It was erosion. And because Claire was thoughtful, articulate, and capable of self-reflection, the tactic worked especially well on her. That is something people rarely understand. Gaslighting is often most effective not against the most irrational person in the room, but against the most conscientious one. The person who is willing to examine themselves. The person who wants to be fair. The person who does not want to accuse someone unjustly. The person who is emotionally mature enough to ask, "Could I be wrong?" That humility, in a healthy relationship, is a strength. In a manipulative relationship, it becomes an entry point. Ethan seemed to know that instinctively. He did not need Claire to believe every absurdity. He only needed her to keep doubting herself enough that his version of reality remained competitive with her own. He did not have to fully convince her that black was white. He only had to keep her in a fog thick enough that she could not walk cleanly toward her own truth. And the fog is the point. That is what so many people miss about gaslighting. The goal is not always persuasion in the ordinary sense. The goal is destabilization. If you are confused, you are easier to control. If you are busy sorting out whether your pain is valid, you are less likely to hold someone accountable for causing it. If you are defending your own sanity, you are no longer evaluating their behavior with the clarity it deserves. Claire began noticing that after hard conversations with Ethan, she often felt the same strange aftermath. Not relief. Not understanding. Not resolution. She felt smaller. Foggy. Ashamed. Restless in her own skin. Sometimes she would stand in her kitchen in Manhattan, city lights flickering beyond the windows, and feel an almost unbearable split inside herself. One part of her knew something was wrong. Another part had already begun building a case against that knowing. That is the private cruelty of gaslighting. It colonizes the space inside you where self-trust is supposed to live. And it does not only happen through direct denial. Sometimes it happens through minimization. Through mockery. Through false concern. Through acting like your distress itself is the real issue. You need to relax. You're spiraling again. You read way too much into everything. I don't know why you insist on turning everything into a problem. I'm actually worried about how intensely you take things. There is something especially sinister about that last move. The manipulator hurts you, then positions themselves as the reasonable one worried about your response to the hurt. They injure, then diagnose. They distort, then observe your confusion as evidence that you are unstable. It is psychological theft. They steal the event from you, then steal the meaning of your reaction too. And because Ethan was not cruel all the time, Claire stayed vulnerable to the next conversation. He could still be warm. Still attentive. Still look at her with softness. Still say things that made her remember the beginning. That inconsistency made the gaslighting even more effective, because it prevented her from forming a simple conclusion. If he were awful all the time, maybe the truth would have been easier to hold. But he was not. He was just destabilizing enough to make her lose confidence in what she knew. The body, however, was keeping score. Claire's sleep changed. Her chest tightened before certain dinners. A single text from Ethan could shift the chemistry of her whole evening. She reread messages more often. She started recounting conversations in her notes app just to pin something down. Not because she wanted evidence for a trial, but because she was beginning to understand something quietly terrifying. If she did not write down what happened before speaking to him again, she might lose access to her own reality. That was not paranoia. That was survival. And strangely, that is also where her healing began. Not in a triumphant confrontation. Not in some cinematic moment where she finally out-argued him. Gaslighting rarely ends that way, because the point was never mutual understanding. Her healing began the day she stopped using Ethan's confidence as a measure of truth. That day mattered. Because people who gaslight often sound incredibly certain. But certainty is not the same thing as honesty. Calm is not the same thing as innocence. Someone can speak in a measured tone and still be manipulating reality. Someone can look composed while quietly making you distrust your own mind. Once Claire truly understood that, the spell weakened. She began asking different questions. Not, how do I prove what happened, but what do I feel every time this happens? Not, what if he didn't mean it, but why do I leave these conversations feeling erased? Not, how can I explain it better, but why does clarity only disappear after he starts talking? That is the turn. That is the beginning of reality returning. The opposite of gaslighting is not aggression. It is grounded self-trust. It is the quiet, steady refusal to let someone else narrate your inner life more convincingly than you can. It is the courage to say, even if only to yourself at first, I know what that felt like. I know what happened in me. I know what keeps happening here. For someone emerging from gaslighting, that kind of clarity can feel almost holy. Because when your mind has been used against you, coming back to yourself is not a small thing. It is liberation. Triangulation: how narcissists create conflict without getting their hands dirty. The cruelest people in a manipulative dynamic are not always the ones who shout the loudest. Sometimes they are the ones who barely seem involved at all. They stand slightly to the side. They tilt the room with one sentence. They plant a thought, a suspicion, a comparison, a subtle emotional charge, and then step back just far enough to watch other people collide. When the fallout comes, they look surprised. Even innocent. Sometimes they look helpful. Sometimes they even look wounded by the very chaos they created. That is triangulation. And it is one of the ugliest tactics narcissists use because it allows them to control relationships without appearing openly controlling. They do not have to dominate the whole room with force. They only have to bend the emotional geometry of it. They do not need to scream, fight. They only need to whisper something that makes peace harder to reach. By the time Claire understood that Ethan was doing this, one of the deepest injuries had already taken root. She had started doubting not only herself, but other people too. Friends she once trusted began feeling ambiguous. Co-workers felt harder to read. Conversations that should have been simple started carrying strange emotional residue. A look. A delay. A sentence repeated back in a slightly different tone than she remembered. It was as if a thin layer of static had been laid over her whole social world. That is the hidden violence of triangulation. It does not just create conflict. It contaminates trust. At first, Claire did not name what was happening because each moment, on its own, seemed too small to justify alarm. Ethan might casually mention that one of her friends had seemed a little cold toward her at dinner. Not as a direct accusation. More as an observation. He would say it gently, almost protectively, the way someone might point out spinach in your teeth. I may be wrong, he would say, but I just got the feeling she envies you a little. Or he would tell Claire that a colleague had praised her publicly but didn't sound entirely sincere. Again, never with enough force to sound openly manipulative. Always with just enough concern to sound perceptive. The comments slipped into her mind the way a drop of ink slips into clear water, quietly, but with consequences that spread. The brilliance of triangulation lies in that softness. It does not usually begin with obvious lies. It begins with implication. A suggestion. A strategic concern. A subtle comparison. The manipulative person frames themselves as someone helping you see the room more clearly, while they are actually making the room harder to see at all. And once doubt enters the system, everything changes. Claire started replaying interactions that once would have passed easily. She wondered whether her friend's distracted mood had hidden something sharper. She reread a text from a coworker and heard a tone she had not noticed before. She began interpreting people through Ethan's private commentary. Without realizing it, she had let his voice become a filter between herself and the rest of the world. That is how triangulation takes hold. The narcissistic person becomes the emotional translator, the interpreter, the one who tells you what other people really mean. They turn themselves into the central channel through which relationships are perceived. Once that happens, they do not merely influence one bond. They begin shaping the entire field. And the field matters. Because narcissistic control rarely depends on direct intimacy alone. It becomes far more powerful when the target is subtly isolated from alternative sources of grounding. Not always through dramatic separation. Sometimes through erosion. If enough tension is created between you and others, if enough suspicion is scattered across your social life, if enough confusion accumulates around the people who once made you feel safe, then the manipulator grows more central by default. Not because they are more trustworthy. Because everyone else has been made to feel uncertain. That is what Ethan was building around Claire. Not a relationship in the healthy sense, but an atmosphere. A system in which he could appear uniquely insightful because he was quietly destabilizing her confidence in everyone else. He never had to say, "Don't trust your friends." That would have been too obvious. He only had to create enough emotional fog that trust stopped feeling simple. The tactic widened over time. At gatherings, he would praise another woman's appearance or intelligence in a way that looked innocent on the surface but landed with surgical precision. He would reference an ex not romantically, but strategically, describing her as someone who really understood how hard life could get sometimes. He would mention how deeply his boss appreciated loyalty, how rare it was to find a woman who was secure enough not to make everything a competition, how exhausting it was when people became defensive around harmless comments. None of those statements were random. They were emotional placements. They were meant to make Claire compare, wonder, prove, compete, or retreat. That is another way triangulation works. It creates a third point in the relationship, real or imagined, so that the target never feels fully secure in a two-person bond. The third point can be another woman. An ex. A parent. A sibling. A friend. A coworker. A child. Even a vague other people who supposedly see things in ways that undermine your position. Once the third point exists, intimacy becomes unstable. You are no longer simply relating to the manipulator. You are relating to their arrangement of others around you. You begin measuring yourself against invisible rivals, against hinted loyalties, against stories you did not ask to be inside. That kind of pressure is exhausting because it rarely gives you anything concrete to confront. The target often feels uneasy but cannot point to one dramatic act. Instead, they are caught inside 1,000 small emotional nudges that leave them feeling off balance and a little ashamed for feeling off balance. That shame is important. It keeps the system alive. Because triangulation often makes the target feel petty, jealous, suspicious, immature. If Claire felt hurt by Ethan's glowing description of another woman, she worried that voicing it would make her seem insecure. If she felt uneasy about the way he relayed things people had supposedly said about her, she worried she would sound paranoid. So instead of naming the pattern, she swallowed the discomfort and tried to become calmer, better, less reactive. Many people do this. They work on themselves inside a system designed to keep injuring them. That is what makes triangulation so psychologically expensive. It turns the target inward in the wrong way. Rather than asking, "Why does this person keep creating emotional static between me and others?" they ask, "Why am I being so affected by this?" And because the narcissistic person often stays composed, the target's emotional reaction becomes further proof that they are the unstable one. The manipulator can then say things like, "I was just telling you what I noticed," or "I can't help that people respond the way they do," or "You're always looking for hidden meanings." That last line is particularly cruel, because it punishes the target for noticing the exact pattern that is harming them. Triangulation also feeds on silence. A manipulative person does not want direct, clean conversation between the people they are positioning against one another. Directness is dangerous to the tactic because it restores reality. If Claire had gone straight to her friend and said, "Did you really say that?" the emotional architecture Ethan was building might have cracked much sooner. But triangulation thrives when everyone stays in their own corner, reacting to impressions, fragments, and emotionally charged second-hand information. This is why the tactic is so common in families as well. One parent subtly tells one child what the other sibling really thinks. One adult child is burdened with information they should never have been given. One person becomes the favored one, then the guilty one, then the resented one. No one ever gets to meet one another in clean, unmanipulated truth because the narcissistic person remains in the middle, translating, leaking, stirring, soothing, and destabilizing all at once. The same thing can happen in friendship circles and workplaces. A narcissistic colleague may praise one person to another, then criticize them privately later. They may imply that someone else has concerns without ever encouraging direct communication. They may position themselves as the trustworthy confidant while quietly making everyone else seem less safe. The result is a room full of people who feel vaguely tense and increasingly divided, while the manipulator looks like the one person trying to keep things together. That performance of innocence is part of the seduction of the tactic. Ethan did not look like an obvious saboteur. He looked observant, protective, socially perceptive. That is why Claire trusted him for so long. She mistook the creation of suspicion for evidence of insight. She thought he was helping her understand people more deeply when, in fact, he was making understanding more difficult. Eventually the emotional cost became impossible to ignore. Claire realized she no longer felt relaxed in her own relationships. She was scanning too much. Comparing too much. Reading too much into things that once would have felt simple. She felt lonelier, not because people had abandoned her, but because Ethan's presence had made connection feel dangerous and interpretation feel unstable. That was the beginning of the awakening. She started asking a different question. Not, who around me is against me, but, who benefits when I become uncertain about everyone else? That question cut through the fog. Because triangulation is not random drama. It has a purpose. It keeps the narcissistic person central. It keeps others distracted. It keeps the target emotionally dependent on the one person who appears to have the clearest read on the chaos, even though they are often the source of it. And once you see that, the whole tactic begins to lose its power. You become less interested in second-hand interpretation and more committed to direct truth. You stop letting one person narrate everyone else's motives. You slow down before reacting. You verify. You ask clean questions. You become harder to split from people who have actually earned your trust. That does not mean every relationship can be repaired. Sometimes the damage in a triangulated system runs deep. Sometimes people really have turned against one another. Sometimes the manipulator has worked for years to ensure that direct trust feels nearly impossible. But even then, clarity changes something inside the target. They stop swallowing every emotional signal as personal weakness. They begin recognizing choreography where they once saw only confusion. They understand that not every tension is organic, not every insecurity is theirs, not every fracture appeared by accident. And that matters. Because one of the deepest forms of healing is learning to ask, when a room feels suddenly strange, not only what happened between us, but who may have needed us divided in the first place. The push-pull cycle: idealize, devalue, discard, repeat. There is a reason people trapped in narcissistic relationships so often sound confused when they try to explain why they stayed. It was not always bad. That is too flat, too simple, too clean for what really happened. What really happened is that the relationship moved like weather in a city that never fully settles. Warm enough to make you leave the window open. Cold enough to make you wake up in the middle of the night wondering what changed. One day there is sunlight flooding the room, and the next day everything is gray, sharp, withholding. You keep waiting for the climate to return to what it was at the beginning, not realizing that the instability is not a phase of the relationship. It is the structure of it. That is the push-pull cycle. And what makes it so destructive is not just the pain of being devalued. It is the hope that survives every injury. It is the way the memory of being adored keeps interfering with your ability to accept what is happening now. It is the way the heart keeps reaching for the first version of the story long after the story itself has changed. By the time Claire began sensing the full emotional logic of Ethan's behavior, she had already been through the cycle enough times to stop calling it a cycle. She was still thinking of it as mood, pressure, stress, misunderstanding, bad timing, emotional complexity, fear of intimacy, childhood wounds, an overworked nervous system, anything except the simplest and most frightening explanation, that the inconsistency itself was part of what kept her attached. In the beginning, Ethan did not merely admire Claire. He elevated her. He made her feel as though meeting her had altered the emotional landscape of his life. His attention carried a kind of intensity that seemed to gather her into focus. Around him, she did not feel incidental. She felt unforgettable. It was not just the affection. It was the force of his certainty. The way he spoke as if what was forming between them had already crossed the line from possibility into significance. And because that early idealization was so emotionally vivid, it did not disappear when his behavior changed. It stayed alive inside Claire like a private archive. Even later, when his warmth became unpredictable, when his sensitivity turned selective, when she found herself leaving conversations feeling diminished instead of cherished, she still had those early memories glowing in the background. They complicated everything. They kept whispering, "This is not the real him. The real him is the one who saw you so beautifully." That whisper is one of the most powerful forces in the push-pull cycle. Because when a narcissistic person idealizes you, they do not just create happiness. They create emotional precedent. They create a version of the bond so intoxicating that every future injury gets measured against it. You do not simply feel disappointed by the coldness that follows. You feel disoriented. You keep trying to reconcile two realities that do not fit together, the person who made you feel extraordinary and the person who now acts irritated by your existence. That split is exhausting. At first, the devaluation may be subtle. A little less warmth. A little more impatience. A joke with a sting in it. A coolness after closeness. Less curiosity. Less tenderness. More correction. More distance. The emotional temperature changes just enough that the body notices before the mind can fully name it. Claire would feel it in small ways, how Ethan's voice shifted when she was excited about something that did not center him, how his face went still when she spoke too long about her own day, how a conversation that once would have ended in warmth now ended in ambiguity. The worst part was not that she could feel the shift. It was that the shift never stayed long enough in one place to become easy to confront. That is what makes the cycle so powerful. If someone rejects you once, you hurt. If someone rejects you cleanly and consistently, eventually you grieve. But if someone alternates between making you feel deeply cherished and strangely disposable, your mind does not grieve in a straight line. It becomes preoccupied, hyper-attuned, hopeful and frightened at the same time. You are not standing in heartbreak. You are standing in suspense. And suspense is incredibly binding. Claire began organizing more and more of her emotional life around Ethan's signals. Not consciously at first. She did not wake up one day and decide that his tone would determine the shape of her nervous system. It happened through repetition. A warm morning text could restore her. A delayed response could flatten the whole day. A sudden affectionate evening after a cold stretch would flood her with relief so intense it felt almost spiritual. She was no longer just living in a relationship. She was living in a pattern of deprivation and reward. This is where many outsiders misunderstand the bond. They think the target stays because they enjoy the good moments too much or because they lack self-respect. But that is not deep enough. The attachment is not formed simply by pleasure. It is intensified by contrast. Relief feels bigger when it comes after pain. A small return of tenderness can feel enormous after emotional drought. The body starts reacting not just to love, but to the ending of distress. That is a dangerous thing. Because then the narcissistic person does not have to provide steady care to remain central. They only have to provide enough relief to keep the hope mechanism alive. Enough warmth to make you believe the connection is still recoverable. Enough softness to make leaving feel premature. Enough sweetness to make your own clarity feel cruel. And sometimes the discard is not dramatic. It is not always abandonment in the cinematic sense. Sometimes it is emotional disappearance while the relationship still technically exists. Ethan could sit across from Claire and feel absent. He could withhold engagement without fully withdrawing. He could make her feel alone in his presence, which is its own kind of discard. There are few pains more destabilizing than being half-kept. Not fully loved, not fully left. Just held in a state of emotional uncertainty where you can neither rest nor resolve. That kind of partial discard creates a special desperation. Because if the relationship were truly over, grief could begin. But when the door stays slightly open, when tenderness reappears just often enough, when the person you miss comes back in flashes, the bond remains active. You do not get to mourn cleanly. You keep getting rehooked by possibility. And possibility can be more addictive than reality. Claire started noticing how much of her internal life had become anticipatory. She was not living fully in her own days anymore. She was waiting. Waiting for Ethan to come back emotionally. Waiting for the next text that sounded like the man from the beginning. Waiting for the next night that felt almost magical again. Waiting for the next moment that would let her believe the relationship had not actually changed, that they had simply been in a hard patch, that all couples go through this, that love requires endurance, patience, insight, empathy, forgiveness. All of those ideas can be noble in healthy love. In a push-pull cycle, they become tools of self-betrayal. Because what Claire was really enduring was not ordinary relational complexity. She was enduring inconsistency so chronic it had begun to rewrite her emotional habits. She no longer trusted peace. She trusted clues. She studied patterns in Ethan's voice, his punctuation, his posture, his choice of words, the speed of his replies, the difference between a warm silence and a punishing one. This is what intermittent reinforcement does. It turns a person into a reader of fragments, a collector of signals, a believer in scraps. And scraps can keep a starving heart alive far longer than they should. A healthy relationship may contain conflict, distance, even seasons of stress. But it does not repeatedly train one person to survive on emotional leftovers while remembering the banquet at the beginning. It does not keep one person longing for a version of closeness that only appears when the bond is at risk of breaking. Real love may ebb and flow, but it does not require instability to generate devotion. That is the difference Claire had to learn. The intensity of reunion is not proof of depth. The relief you feel when coldness ends is not the same as safety. The return of tenderness is not always restoration. Sometimes it is only the next turn of the wheel. This is what makes the cycle so psychologically brutal. It entangles pain with hope so tightly that the target begins defending the very thing that is injuring them. They tell themselves the relationship is complicated because it matters. They interpret the emotional highs as evidence of uniqueness. They call it passion, chemistry, a difficult but powerful bond. And meanwhile the self keeps thinning. Sleep suffers. Concentration slips. Joy narrows. Friends begin noticing a haunted look. The person inside the relationship keeps trying to get back to the beginning, not realizing the beginning may have been the hook. Claire's turning point did not come in one spectacular collapse. It came in a quieter moment, and that made it more devastating. One evening in her Manhattan apartment, she realized she had spent the entire day waiting for Ethan to turn warm again. Not call. Not apologize. Not solve anything. Simply turn warm. She noticed how little that requirement should have been and how large it had become inside her. Her whole emotional state had shrunk to the size of his next shift. That realization shook her. Because in that moment she understood that she was no longer relating to Ethan as a whole person. She was relating to access, withdrawal, return, and loss. She was not in love with stability. She was bonded to unpredictability. And once you see that, something painful but liberating begins. You stop asking only whether they love you. You start asking what the pattern is doing to you. You stop measuring the relationship by its best moments. You start measuring it by its recurring shape. You stop treating every return as proof. You start noticing that you are living inside repetition. That is where truth enters. Not the truth that they never cared at all. Human motives are often messier than that. Not the truth that every soft moment was false. Many manipulative people can feel something real in the moment. The more important truth is this: whatever they felt, the structure of the relationship was harming you. The cycle itself was teaching your nervous system to equate uncertainty with longing and relief with love. And that is not love. Love does not need to keep disappearing to prove its value. Love does not deepen by making you chase your own dignity. Love does not train you to feel grateful for basic warmth after periods of emotional starvation. The push-pull cycle survives on one essential lie, that if you just get it right, the person from the beginning will finally stay. But the person from the beginning was never staying by accident. They were part of the rhythm. And the rhythm was the trap. Shame, guilt, and pity, emotional weapons disguised as vulnerability. There is a form of manipulation that does not look cruel at all when you first encounter it. It looks wounded. It looks tender. It looks like pain. And because it looks like pain, most good-hearted people walk toward it instead of away from it. That is what makes this tactic so devastating. Not every narcissist controls by towering over you. Not every manipulator dominates through arrogance, visible superiority, or overt aggression. Some do something far more psychologically sophisticated. They make you feel guilty for having a boundary, ashamed for naming your pain, and responsible for the emotional collapse that follows when you finally try to tell the truth. In those moments, the relationship becomes almost impossible to evaluate clearly, because the person hurting you no longer appears to be the powerful one. They appear fragile, injured, misunderstood, deeply affected by your honesty. And suddenly, instead of asking whether what they did was wrong, you find yourself asking whether you were too harsh, too cold, too demanding, too insensitive. That reversal is not an accident. By the time Claire reached this stage with Ethan, she had already been through enough confusion to start recognizing certain patterns in herself. She knew she was more anxious than she used to be. She knew she was editing her words too much. She knew she often left conversations feeling guilty even when she had entered them with a valid concern. But she still had not fully understood one of the darkest parts of the dynamic: Ethan did not always need to overpower her directly. Sometimes all he had to do was make her feel cruel for seeing clearly. That worked especially well because Claire was not a hard person. She was discerning, yes. Intelligent, yes. But she was not emotionally careless. She was the kind of person who did not enjoy causing pain, even when pain was deserved. She did not bring up conflict lightly. She did not throw accusations around. If she confronted something, it was usually after long private reflection, after giving the situation the benefit of the doubt, after checking herself more times than most people ever would. And yet somehow, even then, Ethan had a way of turning her honesty into an injury against him. She would say, carefully, that something he had done felt dismissive or unnecessarily sharp. She would not attack him. She would speak in the soft, measured voice people use when they are trying to preserve connection while telling the truth. And almost immediately, the emotional center of the conversation would begin to move. First came the stillness. Then the wounded expression. Then a silence that seemed to accuse her without words. And then some version of the same shift. Ethan would begin speaking not from accountability, but from hurt. Hurt that Claire could think that of him. Hurt that after everything between them, she would reduce him to that. Hurt that she did not seem to understand how much pressure he had been under. Hurt that she could be so severe when he was already struggling. And just like that, the focus changed. The issue was no longer his behavior. The issue became his pain in response to her naming it. This is where shame, guilt, and pity become emotional weapons. Not because these feelings are inherently bad. They are deeply human feelings. In healthy relationships, guilt can help us repair. Shame can alert us to misalignment. Pity, or more accurately compassion, can soften us toward another person's suffering. But in a narcissistic dynamic, these emotions are often hijacked. They are pulled away from truth and repurposed as tools of control. The manipulator does not have to say, "Do not hold me accountable." They create a situation where accountability feels like emotional violence. Claire began noticing that some of her hardest moments with Ethan did not come after his coldness. They came after his apparent brokenness. If he had simply stayed defensive, perhaps the line would have remained clearer. But he often moved into a kind of emotional injury that was much harder to resist. He would look devastated. Or tired in a way that made her feel she had arrived at the worst possible moment. Or he would say something so quietly self-condemning that her whole system would rush toward repair. Maybe I just ruin everything. I don't know why I'm never enough for people. No matter what I do, I end up disappointing the person I love. I guess I really am the problem. Those statements sound vulnerable on the surface. And sometimes they may contain real feeling. But within the manipulative dynamic, their function matters more than their texture. These are not always invitations into honest self-reflection. Often, They are exits from accountability. They force the other person into a new role. Instead of being the one who was hurt, Claire became the one who now had to comfort the person who hurt her. That is the trap. A real conversation about harm becomes an emergency centered on the harmful person's emotional state. Your truth disappears inside their distress. And if you are empathic, if you have a conscience, if you have ever been made to feel responsible for other people's feelings in your life, this tactic can work with terrifying efficiency. Because your instinct is not domination. Your instinct is repair. You see pain and your heart moves toward it. That tenderness is beautiful. In the wrong relationship, it becomes exploitable. That is why so many targets of narcissistic manipulation end up feeling morally confused. They are not just trying to protect themselves. They are trying to protect themselves from someone who appears to be suffering. That makes the line much harder to hold. Claire sometimes felt like she was standing in two realities at once. In one reality, she had been dismissed, belittled, or twisted into emotional knots. In the other, Ethan looked so wounded by her attempt to say that out loud that she began doubting whether she had the right to say it at all. Over time, she started anticipating that reaction before it even happened. She would feel hurt by something, but before speaking, she would already be imagining the fallout, his collapse, his distance, his sadness, the heaviness in the room, the sense that she had somehow made everything worse by bringing truth into it. That anticipation silenced her more than his actual words ever could. This is one of the ugliest forms of control, when someone trains you to betray your own needs not because you fear their rage, but because you fear their pain. Rage at least looks like a threat. Pain looks like innocence. Pain makes you hesitate. Pain makes you explain less. Pain makes you think, maybe now is not the right time. Maybe I should wait. Maybe I should be kinder. Maybe I should ask for less. And slowly, your silence begins to look like love to you. But it is not love. It is adaptation. Ethan also knew how to use guilt in more direct ways. If Claire pulled back to protect herself, he did not always chase her aggressively. Sometimes he became mournful. He spoke as though her distance was abandonment, as though her boundaries had become proof that she was incapable of real commitment, as though her self-protection revealed something ugly about her character. He framed her limits as emotional betrayal. That is another devastating tactic narcissists use. They turn your attempt to preserve your dignity into evidence that you are selfish. And because Claire cared deeply about being a good person, because she did not want to become cynical or cold, because she had always taken pride in being thoughtful with others, this affected her profoundly. She did not want to be cruel. She did not want to become someone who lacked compassion. So each time Ethan used sadness, self-pity, or guilt to respond to her honesty, she became more vulnerable to softening too soon. What she did not yet understand was that compassion without discernment can become a trapdoor. It drops you straight out of your own truth and into someone else's emotional staging. That word is important, staging. Not because every tear is fake. Not because every painful reaction is conscious theater. Human beings are more complicated than that. A narcissistic person may genuinely feel hurt, empty, ashamed, or abandoned in those moments. But genuine feeling does not automatically make their response honest or safe. A person can feel real pain and still use that pain to manipulate. They can cry real tears and still make those tears the reason accountability never lands. The outcome tells the deeper truth. Does the conversation return to what happened? Does repair deepen? Does responsibility increase? Does mutual understanding grow? Or does your concern vanish while their pain takes over the room? That difference matters. Claire's turning point came when she realized something painfully simple: she felt guiltier for speaking up than Ethan ever seemed to feel for hurting her. That imbalance told her more than any one argument ever could. She had been living inside a system where her conscience was always activated and his was always rerouted into self-protection. Once she saw that, pity began losing its power. Not because she became harsh. Not because she stopped caring. But because she started understanding that someone else's emotional reaction is not always a moral verdict on your truth. A boundary can make a manipulative person feel wounded. Honesty can make them feel exposed. Distance can make them feel abandoned. None of that automatically means your boundary was wrong, your honesty was cruel, or your distance was unfair. Sometimes it simply means they can no longer control the emotional narrative as easily as before. That realization is one of the great maturities of healing. You learn that compassion and clarity must live together. You can care about someone's pain without surrendering your reality to it. You can see their wounds without letting those wounds become permission slips for your mistreatment. You can remain tender without becoming endlessly available for emotional reversal. And for someone like Claire, that was a profound change. Because she did not need to become colder. She needed to stop confusing her empathy with obligation. She needed to understand that guilt is not always guidance. Sometimes guilt is just the echo of having been trained to abandon yourself the moment someone else looks hurt enough. Erosion of identity: the real goal is your self-doubt. There comes a point in a narcissistic relationship when the damage is no longer located in any single argument. It is no longer just about what was said at dinner, what happened in the car, what tone was used in that text, what private moment was later denied, what wound was minimized, or what truth was turned inside out until it looked like your fault. All of those things matter. All of them leave marks. But eventually something even more devastating begins to happen. You stop trusting the person you are becoming. That is the deeper injury. Not simply that Claire was being hurt by Ethan, but that over time she began to feel estranged from herself. As though somewhere inside the relationship, without ever formally agreeing to it, she had handed over the authority to define what was real, what was reasonable, what was excessive, what was selfish, what was loving, what was cruel, what was too much, and what she was allowed to feel. That kind of erosion is hard to explain to people who have never lived it. From the outside, a person may still look composed. They still go to work. They still answer messages. They still show up to dinners, carry groceries, make appointments, laugh at the right moments, keep their life moving. But inside, something essential has started to thin out. A private solidity. A quiet inner continuity. The sense that your thoughts belong to you, your instincts belong to you, your preferences belong to you, and your emotional reality does not need to be argued into existence every time it appears. By the time Claire reached this stage with Ethan, she was no longer only reacting to him. She was anticipating him. That is when manipulation moves from event to environment. He did not have to be in the room for his influence to be present. He lived in her timing, in her editing, in the small hesitations that entered her body before certain words left her mouth. She started speaking in drafts. Even simple things. What restaurant did she want to go to? What did she really think of that friend? How tired was she? Did she want to stay out or go home? Was that comment funny, rude, or was she just in the wrong mood again? Before, these would have been ordinary internal movements. Natural, immediate, human. Now each one seemed to pass through an invisible filter. Not, what do I feel, but, how will this land? Not, What do I want, but, what version of wanting this will create the least friction? Not, what do I think, but, can I defend this thought if it gets turned into a debate? That is what erosion looks like in real time. It does not always announce itself dramatically. Sometimes it looks like becoming more reasonable, more patient, more self-controlled. That is one reason it can go unnoticed for so long. Claire did not think, at first, that she was disappearing. She thought she was becoming better at relationships. Better at choosing her moments. Better at phrasing things gently. Better at not escalating. Better at being mature. But maturity does not make a person feel less alive. Adaptation does. And adaptation can become so sophisticated that the person no longer notices how much of themselves has been reorganized around survival. Claire began losing tiny things first. Spontaneity. Lightness. The desire to tell a story all the way through without worrying she would be interrupted, corrected, or subtly deflated. She stopped reaching for certain clothes because Ethan's reactions had made them feel vaguely unsafe. She stopped sharing certain victories because praise from him had become so thin, so strained, so contaminated by competition that celebration no longer felt good. She even noticed changes in her body. Her shoulders stayed tight longer. Her sleep grew shallower. There were evenings when the sound of her phone lighting up filled her with dread before she had even read the message. The body often knows identity is under threat before the mind has language for it. That is because identity is not just a set of beliefs about who you are. It is a lived experience of occupying yourself. It is the ease with which you move from one thought to the next, one feeling to the next, one preference to the next, without constantly needing external permission to validate your inner life. When that ease begins to disappear, a person can still look functional while feeling profoundly dislocated. Claire felt that dislocation in the smallest moments. Standing in front of her closet in Manhattan, unable to tell whether she genuinely liked something or whether she had quietly internalized Ethan's taste. Sitting across from a friend at brunch and realizing she was no longer speaking freely because some part of her had begun assuming she might later have to justify every word. Coming home after a long day and not knowing whether the exhaustion in her body was ordinary fatigue or emotional depletion from spending so much time monitoring herself. This is what people often miss when they talk about narcissistic abuse too simplistically. The deepest goal is not always open domination. It is self-doubt. If someone can make you uncertain enough about your own perceptions, your own needs, your own motives, your own memory, and eventually your own character, then they do not need to control every decision directly. You begin doing part of the work for them. You censor yourself before they have to. You soften your truth before they need to challenge it. You abandon your own position before they even arrive to push you off it. That is the true efficiency of psychological erosion. And one of the most painful side effects is that the target often begins behaving in ways they do not recognize or respect. Claire, who once prided herself on honesty, found herself omitting things. Not because she had become deceptive by nature, but because truth had become expensive. It was easier not to mention lunch with a friend Ethan disliked. Easier not to say how much something had bothered her. Easier not to admit how relieved she felt when he cancelled. Easier to flatten, reduce, blur, and manage reality than to keep paying the emotional price of full transparency. This is one of the cruelest aspects of narcissistic systems. They can train decent people into survival behaviors that later fill them with shame. The person starts saying, "I don't like who I became." And sometimes that is true. But it is not the whole truth. They did not become that person in a vacuum. They adapted to a relational climate where directness was punished, reality was unstable, and emotional safety depended on calibration. That does not excuse every coping mechanism. It explains them. And explanation matters, because shame thrives where context has been erased. Claire also noticed a more private loss. She no longer knew what she felt until she had sorted through what Ethan might say about it. This was perhaps the deepest wound of all. Before him, her emotional life had texture. Complexity, yes. Contradictions, yes. But it was hers. Now even her own reactions felt cross-examined from within. If she felt hurt, an inner voice rose immediately to challenge it. If she felt anger, another voice asked whether anger was fair. If she felt distance, another voice accused her of cruelty. Over time, Ethan's influence had become internalized, not as memory but as structure. He no longer had to dismiss her in real time. Part of her had learned to do it on his behalf. That is why the recovery from this kind of relationship is never just about leaving the person. It is about disentangling from the voice they planted in your relationship with yourself. And that disentangling can feel strange at first because health is quieter than chaos. When Claire began pulling away from Ethan emotionally, she expected immediate relief. Some of it came. But so did emptiness. Space. Silence. A kind of frightening stillness in which she had to meet herself again without the constant pressure of reacting, explaining, anticipating, or repairing. For a while, she did not know what to do with that stillness. She had lived so long in emotional vigilance that peace itself felt unfamiliar. This is something many survivors do not expect. When your identity has been eroded gradually, rebuilding it does not always begin with confidence. It often begins with awkwardness. With not knowing. With standing in your own kitchen and realizing you genuinely cannot tell what you want for dinner. With going for a walk and noticing how often your thoughts still loop back to what they would think, say, accuse, reinterpret. With sitting alone and discovering that the most basic question, what do I feel, has become harder to answer than it should be. But that does not mean the self is gone. It means it has been buried under adaptation. And buried is not the same as destroyed. Claire's return to herself began in quiet, unimpressive ways. Writing down what happened after conversations instead of letting her mind blur it. Playing music Ethan used to mock just to hear what her body did when no one was there to correct her taste. Saying no to small things without offering an essay in self-defense. Letting a text sit unanswered until she actually knew what she wanted to say. Asking herself simple questions she had stopped asking: am I tired? Am I hungry? Do I want company? Do I want quiet? Do I like this? Do I trust that? Do I feel smaller after seeing him? These are not trivial exercises. They are acts of self-reunion. Because identity repair is rarely dramatic. It is built through repetition. Through honoring your own signals often enough that the nervous system slowly relearns: my inner life is not a courtroom. My feelings are not crimes. My instincts are not inconveniences. My needs are not evidence of defect. I do not need to disappear in order to be loved. That last truth may be the hardest one. Especially for someone like Claire, who had spent so long trying to preserve the relationship without fully admitting how much of herself it was costing. The grief was not only about Ethan. It was also about the realization that she had spent months, maybe longer, negotiating herself downward in exchange for connection. That realization can break a heart open in a very particular way. Not because it proves weakness, but because it reveals how expensive hope can become when placed in the wrong hands. Still, There is something beautiful hidden inside this stage of the story. Once you see that self-doubt was the real target, everything starts making more sense. You stop treating your confusion as proof that you were failing. You start understanding that confusion was part of the injury. You stop asking why you were not stronger sooner. You start asking what kind of environment teaches a person to mistrust themselves this deeply. And in that shift, compassion enters. Not indulgence. Not denial. Compassion. The kind that says, of course I changed in there. Of course I became vigilant. Of course I lost touch with parts of myself. That is what happens when someone keeps asking you to step away from your own reality in order to keep the bond alive. But now the work is different. Now the work is to come back. Not all at once. Not perfectly. Not with some grand performance of empowerment. Just honestly. Patiently. Day by day. Signal by signal. Truth by truth. Because the most radical thing a person can do after narcissistic erosion is not merely leave. It is to become someone who can hear themselves again. Why smart, strong, loving people still get trapped. One of the most damaging lies survivors carry after a narcissistic relationship is not the lie the narcissist told them. It is the lie they begin telling themselves afterward. A woman like Claire, intelligent, self-aware, emotionally literate, professionally successful, the kind of woman other people come to for perspective, support, and calm judgment, should have seen it sooner. She should have known better. She should have left faster. She should not have been pulled in so deeply by someone like Ethan. She should have recognized the pattern before it reached her identity, her nervous system, her sense of self. That word should become its own private prison. Because it sounds like accountability, but most of the time it is just shame wearing the mask of wisdom. And shame is often the final insult narcissistic manipulation leaves behind. Not only were you hurt. Not only were you destabilized. Not only did you spend months or years trying to make sense of something that kept rearranging itself. Now, on top of all that, you are invited to judge yourself for being human in the presence of someone who knew exactly how to exploit what was best in you. That is why this part of the story matters so much. Because people do not get trapped only because they are fragile, lost, or broken in some obvious way. Sometimes they get trapped because they are strong enough to endure more than they should. Because they are loving enough to keep looking for context long after the pattern is clear. Because they are smart enough to generate sophisticated explanations for behavior that should have simply disqualified the relationship. Because they are conscientious enough to question themselves before accusing anyone else. Because they have enough empathy to keep seeing the wound in the person who is wounding them. In other words, many people do not get trapped despite their strengths. They get trapped through them. Claire could not fully understand that at first. For a long time, she believed the fact that Ethan had gotten so deeply into her life must reveal some hidden defect in her. Something unresolved. Something naive. Something in her that wanted to be chosen too badly, needed too much, ignored too many signs, romanticized too much intensity, or lacked whatever instinct everyone else seemed to have. But that interpretation was too cruel and far too shallow. The truth was more unsettling and more compassionate at the same time. Ethan did not gain power in her life because she lacked intelligence. He gained power because intelligence does not automatically protect a person from emotional manipulation. A sharp mind can recognize patterns in business, strategy, politics, finance, and risk. But intimacy is not a spreadsheet. It is happening inside the body, inside attachment, inside loneliness, inside longing, inside hope. It is happening in the place where people most want to believe that sincerity means safety. That is a very different terrain. Claire's competence had served her well in almost every other domain of life. She could read a room. She could solve problems. She could manage pressure. She could function while grieving, while exhausted, while carrying more than most people ever saw. Those traits made her look powerful from the outside. But inside a narcissistic dynamic, some of those same strengths became liabilities. Her capacity to tolerate discomfort kept her in situations she should not have had to normalize. Her emotional nuance kept her generating explanations instead of conclusions. Her discipline kept her steady when she should have let herself break the illusion sooner. Her loyalty made her reluctant to reduce someone to their worst behavior, even when their worst behavior kept repeating. Her self-reflection made her a perfect target for gaslighting because she was the kind of person who would always ask, "Could I be wrong?" And that question, beautiful in a healthy bond, became dangerous in the wrong one. This is why so many smart people stay trapped longer than others expect. Not because they are blind, but because they keep trying to understand the manipulator through a framework of health. They assume there must be a bridge. A breakthrough. A wording. A better moment. A deeper context. A childhood wound. A hidden fear. A way to reach the good part of the person consistently if only they are patient enough, wise enough, clear enough, loving enough. The smarter the person, the more intricate the explanations can become. The stronger the person, the more pain they can absorb without immediately collapsing. The more loving the person, the more likely they are to keep searching for the wounded human underneath the harmful pattern. And that is exactly what makes them vulnerable. Not weak. Vulnerable. There is a difference. A narcissistic person often does not need a person who is easy to dominate from the beginning. In fact, many of them are drawn to people with substance. People with depth, capability, beauty, warmth, social credibility, moral seriousness. They are often attracted to what shines because controlling something bright feels more rewarding than controlling something already broken. To be chosen by someone impressive becomes a form of narcissistic supply. To slowly bend someone strong becomes a proof of power. That is one reason the target is so often someone others admire. The woman everyone says is grounded. The man everyone says is impossible to fool. The friend who gives the best advice. The parent who holds everything together. The professional who leads with confidence. The person who survives hard things without becoming bitter. From the outside, it makes no sense. But from the inside, it makes devastating sense. These people are valuable. They are resilient. They do not leave after the first rupture. They do not rush to villainize. They are capable of carrying ambiguity for a long time. And narcissistic dynamics thrive in ambiguity. Claire also came to understand something else that changed the way she saw herself: timing matters. Even strong people have seasons. Seasons of loneliness. Grief. Overwork. Quiet hunger. Transition. Reinvention. Even the most stable person can encounter someone like Ethan at a moment when life has left them more open than usual. Not foolish. Open. That openness may come after a breakup. After the death of a parent. After burnout. After success that still somehow feels empty. After years of taking care of everyone else. After moving through Manhattan feeling surrounded by people yet strangely untouched by real closeness. In those seasons, attention lands differently. Warmth matters more. Precision feels intimate more quickly. A person who seems emotionally fluent can feel like medicine. That is not something to be ashamed of. It is something to honor with tenderness. Because one of the deepest healing truths is this: your longing did not cause the manipulation. Your humanity did not create the harm. Your wish to be loved well was not the mistake. The mistake belonged to the person who noticed your openness and used it as an entry point instead of treating it like the sacred thing it was. Claire needed that truth desperately, because shame had begun making her harsh with herself. She replayed the whole relationship as though the entire story could be reduced to a single humiliating question: how did I let this happen? But that question can become a weapon if it is asked without compassion. A better question is, what qualities in me were exploited here? That question opens a very different door. Maybe it was your empathy. Maybe it was your optimism. Maybe it was your ability to endure. Maybe it was your loyalty. Maybe it was your seriousness about love. Maybe it was your refusal to reduce people too quickly. Maybe it was your hope that with enough honesty, two adults could work through almost anything. None of those qualities are embarrassing. They are beautiful qualities that were mishandled. That does not mean they need to be thrown away. It means they need protection. This is where many survivors go wrong after narcissistic harm. They think the lesson is to become colder, more cynical, more suspicious, more detached, less generous, less trusting, less open. But the real lesson is usually more refined than that. You do not need a personality transplant. You need stronger discernment around where your best qualities are allowed to land. You need clearer gates. You need better timing. You need more reverence for your own signals. You need to stop measuring character by chemistry. And perhaps most of all, you need to stop assuming that being loving obligates you to remain available for patterns that keep harming you. That was one of the final pieces Claire had to learn. She had spent so much time trying to ensure she did not become unfair, cold, reactive, or closed off that she had not noticed how little room she was leaving for self-protection. She was so committed to being a good person that she kept tolerating a damaging dynamic long after her body knew better. There is a quiet tragedy in that. But there is also wisdom. Because once you understand that goodness itself can be exploited, you become more careful without becoming hard. You stop blaming your heart for having a door. You simply become more selective about who gets to walk through it. That is a mature kind of power. Not the brittle power of pretending nothing can touch you. The deeper power of knowing that being touched is not the problem. The problem is staying where your tenderness is used against you. Claire was never foolish for wanting connection. She was never pathetic for hoping the best in Ethan would become the whole truth. She was never weak because it took time to name what was happening. She was a human being with strengths that made her admirable and, in the wrong relationship, exploitable. That distinction restored some of her dignity. And dignity matters in recovery, because shame keeps people bent over. Dignity helps them stand back up. So if you have ever looked back on a manipulative relationship and thought, how did someone like me get trapped in something like that? Perhaps the answer is not that there was less strength in you than you believed. Perhaps the answer is that there was more heart in you than the situation deserved, more endurance than the relationship had earned, more empathy than the other person knew how to honor, and more hope than the pattern ever had the right to ask for. That is not weakness. That is beauty without the right boundaries. And beauty with boundaries becomes wisdom. Reclaiming your mind, your boundaries, and your life. There is a moment in recovery that does not look dramatic from the outside, but inside, it changes everything. It is not the moment Claire finally explains herself perfectly. It is not the moment Ethan suddenly understands the damage he caused. It is not even the moment she fully stops loving the version of him she once believed in. It is something quieter than that, and far more powerful. It is the moment she stops asking, "How do I get him to see what he did?" and starts asking, "Why have I been leaving myself every time I try to be understood by someone committed to misunderstanding me?" That question is the beginning of reclamation. Not revenge. Not performance. Not some polished, cinematic comeback that leaves the manipulator speechless. Real recovery rarely looks like that. Real recovery is humbler, slower, deeper, and far more sacred. It is the gradual return of your own mind. Your own pace. Your own standards. Your own appetite for peace. Your own voice, sounding less frightened each time it tells the truth. By the time Claire reached this point, she was exhausted in a way sleep could not fix. Manhattan still moved outside her windows with its usual confidence: sirens, headlights, expensive dinners, people rushing toward futures that looked important from the street. But inside her apartment, she had begun to understand that the real emergency was no longer Ethan. The real emergency was the extent to which she had learned to organize herself around his instability. That realization hurt more than she expected. Because it forced her to confront a painful truth: the relationship had not only taken from her. It had trained her. It had trained her to over-explain, to over-accommodate, to doubt her own emotional timing, to treat discomfort as a problem to solve rather than a message to hear, to make endless room for someone else's complexity while shrinking her own reality until it fit inside whatever version of events would cause the least conflict. And recovery, she began to see, would require more than distance from Ethan. It would require unlearning the habits of self-abandonment that had become second nature. That is the part people rarely talk about enough. Leaving a manipulative dynamic is not the same as leaving the psychological structure it built inside you. A person can be physically gone and still narrate your mind. They can be absent from your apartment, absent from your bed, absent from your calendar, and still present in your reflex to apologize too quickly, to soften your truth, to second-guess your perception, to fear that clarity is cruelty, to confuse peace with emptiness because chaos has become so familiar. So the work of reclaiming your life is not simply escaping them. It is returning to yourself. And returning to yourself after narcissistic manipulation is one of the bravest things a person can do, because it asks you to trust what was systematically weakened. Your own perception. Your own body. Your own sense of timing. Your own interpretation of what feels safe, honest, clean, and real. It asks you to stop waiting for external permission to believe what your nervous system has known for a long time. Claire did not reclaim herself all at once. There was no perfect turning point, no single speech that restored everything. Instead, recovery came in small acts that would have looked unimpressive to anyone else but felt revolutionary in the privacy of her own life. She started writing things down. Not because she needed evidence anymore, but because she wanted to hear herself without interruption. After a conversation, after a text, after a wave of doubt, she would sit at her kitchen counter with the city glowing faintly beyond the glass and write in plain language: "What happened? What did I feel before I started explaining it away? What was denied? What part of me went quiet? What do I know is true?" That practice began restoring something precious: reality confidence. Not certainty about everything. Not rigidness. Not the desperate need to be right. Something much steadier than that. A growing trust that her experience did not become invalid simply because someone else disagreed with it. A growing recognition that her body had been telling the truth long before her mind was ready to believe it. A growing willingness to honor discomfort instead of negotiating with it until it became unrecognizable. She also began practicing smaller boundaries, not because she had suddenly become fearless, but because she realized fear had been making too many decisions for her. She let texts sit unanswered until she genuinely knew what she wanted to say. She stopped writing 5-paragraph explanations to justify a simple no. She declined invitations when she was tired. She left conversations when they became circular. She allowed other people to be disappointed without rushing in to rescue the situation with over-accommodation. This was harder than it sounds. For someone emerging from a narcissistic dynamic, boundaries do not always feel empowering at first. They can feel cruel, unsafe, unnatural. The body may respond to healthy self-protection as though it were doing something wrong, because it has been conditioned to interpret other people's displeasure as danger. So Claire had to learn a profound truth slowly, through repetition. Guilt is not always a sign that you are failing your values. Sometimes it is simply the emotional cost of no longer betraying yourself. That distinction changed her life. She stopped seeing boundaries as weapons and began seeing them as architecture. Not walls built out of bitterness, but structures built out of self-respect. A way of deciding what kind of treatment she would no longer negotiate into normalcy. A way of creating conditions under which her mind, body, and identity could begin to settle again. She also had to rebuild her relationship with peace. This surprised her. She thought once the confusion started clearing, relief would come in one clean wave. Instead, quiet sometimes felt strange. Even unsettling. There were evenings when the absence of emotional chaos made her feel almost untethered, as though she had spent so long bracing that she no longer knew what to do with unbroken stillness. She missed the highs sometimes, which embarrassed her until she understood that what she missed was not the damage. She missed intensity. She missed being flooded. She missed the sudden return of warmth after deprivation because her nervous system had learned to experience relief as love. Recognizing that did not make her weak. It made her honest. And honesty is essential in healing. Because recovery is not a performance of perfect detachment. It is the humble, sometimes painful process of telling the truth about what your body got used to and what your spirit actually deserves. Claire had to learn that peace can feel quiet before it feels beautiful. That consistency can feel unfamiliar before it feels trustworthy. That a calm day may seem emotionally empty to a nervous system trained on volatility, even while it is precisely the kind of day that allows the self to come home. So she gave herself new rituals. Morning walks without checking her phone. Music she loved, played not for atmosphere but for memory. Dinners with friends who did not leave her confused. Books that asked nothing from her except presence. A standing promise to herself that she would not argue her body out of what it knew. These were not glamorous acts. But together they formed a new life. And slowly, that life became more interesting than the old chaos. That is one of the deepest signs of recovery, when your energy shifts from trying to decipher the manipulator to building a reality that no longer requires their explanation. When you become more interested in your own peace than in solving their contradictions. When you stop asking whether they ever really loved you and start asking what love will require from you now that you know what distortion costs. For Claire, that answer became increasingly clear. Love would require honesty. Love would require pace. Love would require mutuality. Love would require responsibility. Love would require the freedom to remain fully herself. Anything that asked her to become smaller in exchange for closeness was no longer love she was willing to call love. That sentence did not arrive all at once. It was earned. Through grief. Through relapse into old thought patterns. Through nights of missing what never truly stabilized. Through the humiliation of seeing how much she had accepted. Through the tenderness of learning not to punish herself for that acceptance. Through the quiet discipline of choosing herself in small ways until choosing herself no longer felt like betrayal. There is real grief in this part of the journey. Not just grief for the relationship, but grief for the time, the energy, the innocence, the self-trust that was worn down. Grief for how long it took. Grief for how much of her brilliance got diverted into survival. Grief for the woman who kept thinking one more conversation would save something that had been costing her too much for too long. But grief, when held honestly, can become a cleansing force. Because grief is what allows illusion to die with dignity. And once illusion dies, reality can begin to nourish you again. Claire eventually understood something that would have sounded impossible to her at the beginning: closure was never going to come from Ethan. It was not waiting inside one final conversation. It was not hidden in the perfect explanation, the ideal confrontation, the apology he might never give, or the insight she kept hoping he would one day reach. Closure came when she stopped asking him to return what he had taken and began rebuilding it herself. Her clarity. Her steadiness. Her boundaries. Her joy. Her trust in her own mind. That is the real ending narcissistic manipulation hopes you never reach. Not the moment you leave them physically, but the moment you become emotionally uninterested in using them as the source of your reality. The moment you no longer need them to agree in order for your truth to stand. The moment your life starts expanding again because it is no longer arranged around confusion. That is freedom. Not loud. Not performative. Not dramatic. Just real. And if there is one final truth worth holding at the center of this entire journey, it is this: healing is not becoming hard. Healing is becoming clear. Clear about what happened. Clear about what you felt. Clear about what you ignored. Clear about what you deserve. Clear about what your body has been trying to tell you. Clear about the kind of love that does not require the slow surrender of your selfhood. Claire did not become a different woman in the end. She became more fully the woman she had been asked to abandon. And that is the quiet miracle of recovery. Not that you become someone new. But that after all the confusion, all the distortion, all the emotional weather and all the self-doubt, you finally come back to the one person you should never have had to leave. Yourself. Claire's story is not just about one manipulative man in Manhattan. It is about what happens when a person slowly loses the right to trust their own inner world. At first, Ethan did not enter her life like a threat. He entered like recognition. He seemed to understand her, admire her, mirror her, and choose her with unusual intensity. What looked like intimacy was often acceleration. What felt like emotional depth was often strategic access. Over time, the relationship stopped being a place where Claire felt loved and became a place where she felt watched, corrected, destabilized, and gradually separated from herself. Gaslighting made her question her perception. Triangulation made her question other people. The push-pull cycle made her confuse relief with love. Shame, guilt, and pity made her feel cruel for telling the truth. And the deepest wound of all was not just heartbreak. It was self-doubt. She did not simply lose peace with Ethan. She almost lost peace with Claire. But that is not where her story ends. The most powerful part of Claire's journey is that she did not heal by winning an argument, getting the perfect apology, or forcing Ethan to finally see what he had done. She healed when she stopped building her reality around his reactions. She healed when she began trusting patterns over promises, her body over confusion, and her truth over his performance. She healed when she realized that love should not require the slow surrender of her identity. In the end, Claire did not become colder. She became clearer. She did not become someone else. She became more fully herself again. And that is the lesson for all of us. The deepest danger in manipulative relationships is not only that someone can hurt you. It is that they can train you to abandon yourself while calling it love, patience, understanding, or loyalty. The lesson is not to become suspicious of everyone. The lesson is to become more honest about what peace feels like, more respectful of your own discomfort, and more careful about who gets access to your tenderness. In real life, this means slowing down when a connection feels overwhelmingly intense, noticing whether a relationship brings clarity or confusion, refusing to explain away repeated patterns that keep shrinking you, and understanding that boundaries are not cruelty. They are self-respect in action. This video is for educational and informational purposes only, based on shared knowledge and reflection. It is not a substitute for diagnosis, therapy, or professional mental health treatment from a licensed psychologist or psychiatrist. Now here's a quick question for you. When a relationship keeps leaving you confused, drained, and unsure of yourself, what matters more? A. The beautiful memories from the beginning. B. The repeated pattern of how the relationship feels now. Comment A or B below. And I'd really love to hear your perspective too. What part of Claire's story hit you the hardest, or what lesson do you think people most need to hear today? Share your thoughts in the comments so everyone can learn from each other. And if this video gave you clarity, language, or comfort, subscribe to the channel to support the work and help keep these deeper, more meaningful conversations coming.